Edward Said's Orientalism, first published in 1978, is a hugely influential book. If you work in almost any historical field it touches on, you will likely have read, or at least skimmed it. It created a stir almost immediately and continues to provoke to this day, in part because it crystallised and has become a shorthand for ideas which were already present in scholarship at that time, and because its basic arguments, which have since become commonplace wisdom in some fields, are quite uncomfortable. They challenge the authority of those who talk about the Orient. In fact, its impact is probably best illustrated by the linguistic shift it caused. We generally do not say the Orient anymore. In fact, you're going to have to imagine air quotes around every time I use it. I don't know many people who would describe themselves as Orientalists, and while in the 1970s these were still just technical terms to describe a geographic area or an academic specialism, they have since come to take on something of the character of an insult. Orientalism is a dense, complex book, in which Said is prone to tangents, or to presuming later parts of the argument. In principle, it is divided into 12 sections, in 3 parts, plus an introduction, which essentially outlines what those sections are about to say. The writing style can be captivating if you let it flow over you, but it is also nuanced in a way a short video essay cannot capture. Take, for example, this passage, which I think also summarises a lot of Said's main concerns. We have Said's focus on Islam, on the way academic work has, and does, create a generalised picture which is often resistant to the reality it describes, and does it within a political context. We see his style, metaphor, clever turn of phrase, long lists of names. Don't feel bad if you do not know who these people are. Said does not footnote here Holt's introduction to the 1970 Cambridge History of Islam, and none of these people have been discussed yet in the book. Gibb is introduced in the next paragraph. Renan, Grunenbaum and Lewis appear much later, but Goldziher is only ever mentioned in passing. Let me turn to the argument. Said's first chapter begins with the early 20th century British politicians Balfour and Cromer and their remarks on Egypt. It introduces several important themes. Prejudicial assumptions are often represented as empirical truth. Politics and scholarship are entwined. The substitution of academic theories for reality. The third of these we might think of as the central problem, while the first 2 are why that problem matters. The next 3 sections are a chronological survey of Western descriptions of the Orient. It touches on poets like Dante, political figures like Napoleon and William Jones, and academics like Gibbs. The second part of the book focuses on the period from the late 18th to the early 19th century and how the kinds of descriptions in the first part came into being. How processes of generalisation, attempts at objectivity, and writing for an audience unfamiliar with the subject can distort, and how an academic field can sustain and magnify that distortion. The third part of the book is again in 4 sections and continues the chronological treatment, taking us from the early 20th century to Said's contemporaries. In the logic of the argument, the previous sections have described how the West presents the Orient and how these presentations came to be the way they are, while this part focuses on the implications. The first implication is the existence of what Said calls latent Orientalism, a set of ideas that remain unchanged and dominate all descriptions, ideas about the inferiority of the Oriental and the superiority of the West. These are explored further in the second section, which makes a direct connection between Orientalism and racism. There's no great surprise, because race, while it's a discredited concept now, was a central concept in academic fields in the 19th century. The third section is much more focused, specifically on the way Islam in particular is presented as unchanging and antagonistic. The final section, which also acts as a conclusion, moves to Said's contemporaries, essentially arguing that all of the features seen in previous chapters are still present in public understandings about the Islamic world, and that academics remain complicit in that. As Said says, books and articles are regularly published on Islam and the Arabs that represent absolutely no change over the virulent anti-Islamic polemics of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. For no other ethnic or religious group is it true that virtually anything can be written or said about it without challenge or demurral. The final chapter is the hardest to read sympathetically, partly because, as this passage illustrates, it often tips over into polemic or hyperbole. However, read sympathetically, Said's book does have a coherent argument. It argues that we can see in work from previous generations a great deal of prejudice and bigotry. We can see that scholarly work was complicit in colonial projects, and how this was possible because of systemic problems in academic writing, the idea of generalising from an individual instance, a rhetoric of detached objectivity, the political reality that makes studies useful. And if we can see that in past works, when we don't share the assumptions of the writers, is it possible that it is still true in the present? Is it possible that it is still true in our own work? I've already mentioned one of the legacy of Said's work, the linguistic shift away from words like Orient and Orientalist. I would not see my work on northern India as having any more in common with work on China or the Near East than it does with the study of Greece or Rome. And if not directly down to Said, that is a function of the intellectual trends he was part of. However, Said tends to get discussed and referenced in fields where his ideas parallel those of the field itself. So in my area of interest, his discussion of Orientalism, though he focuses primarily on Islam and the Near East, sounds a lot like critiques of colonial historiography, which were already current in the 1970s and have remained a constant part of South Asian history ever since. I'm not sure it has had the same impact in Islamic studies. For example, he spends some time critiquing the Cambridge History of Islam. Yet, when a multi-volume replacement was published in 2010, there was no attempt to engage with Said, the only reference being a single remark in the introduction, which so misrepresents Said's argument as to be genuinely hard to understand. In those fields that do seem to have engaged with Said, it seems one of the legacies of the book is that it is given a theoretical veneer to critiquing a work through its author. That is normally enough in literary studies, but it's not really how you do things in the humanities. It is often mistakenly thought of as an ad hominem fallacy. Said partly authorises this by raising his own experience as an Arab Palestinian living in America in the introduction, essentially inviting the reader to imagine how that life experience might have led to this work. This has become a commonplace in introductions. Writers often self-reflectively lay out their own experience and how it might relate to their subject, thinking about the privileged position they enjoy as a writer. I'm not going to try and discuss criticisms of Said's work. There are a huge variety of possible criticisms, and he is guilty of some of the kinds of generalisations he accuses others of, assuming that what is valid for Islam applies equally to all studies of the Orient, or taking the West as a coherent concept. It's also the case that it does not follow that because previous studies have these flaws, that they necessarily apply to current studies. After all, we are now more than 40 years past the publication of Orientalism. But there is one thing I think needs to be discussed, and I've alluded to it already. Said's writing style. The diffuse way he argues, often assuming conclusions or discussions that are yet to happen, mean that unless you are already convinced that the problem is in fact a problem, it is very easy to dismiss him. For example, in the middle section, to illustrate how data is transformed by the academic process, he looks at Edward William Lane's An Account of the Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians. Lane spent several years in Egypt immersed in local culture, but in writing the book, he reshapes this data, which is really a narrative about his individual experience, into a generalised account of Egyptian life from birth to death, and at the same time he takes pains to reassure his reader that his immersion was a deception, that he only pretended to be a Muslim, which reiterates one of Said's central ideas, that Lane is allowed to speak for the Egyptians because he is a European, that a Muslim would not be allowed to speak for themselves. And we can see from this how structural pressures, the expectations of the audience, the nature of academic writing, serve to generalise personal experience and place the European academic in a privileged position. However, it takes Said 7 pages to say that, and he frequently anticipates the conclusion in doing so. So if you read it unsympathetically, it comes across as a series of unsupported assertions rather than an argument. Said's position is that there are serious structural problems with academic writing on other societies, that they generalise obscure individuals and privilege the academic's point of view, and then create a feedback loop in which others draw on the academic's text so that the picture created comes to have more sway than the reality, often with prejudicial results. There is no question this was true in the past, but is it still true today? Well, have you read a book about India, the Middle East or China, written by a European or an American? If you've read a book about those places, I would warrant the answer is yes. By contrast, have you ever read a book about the Romans, the Normans, or Columbus, written by an Indian, Chinese, or Middle Eastern author? The academic world remains one in which Europeans, or North Americans, speak for others. In the phrase Said is so fond of quoting, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. So Said's challenge, are we part of the problem, does indeed remain relevant today.